I had planned a very different presentation an hour ago. But in light of the level of the debate that's been going on, I think I need to address not my affirmative argument, but it's time for a rebuttal. It's time to address the reality of why I consider myself a reparationist and why it's so important and so fundamentally significant for all of us to embrace reparations as perhaps the most significant effort for racial justice, not just in the United States, but in the world in the 21st century. And in the small amount of time I have, I can only address a few points, and I hope you will take this outline as an indication. There is forceful and persuasive points for everything you've heard, and I only wish that we didn't have the clock running out so that we can have a serious, sustained, and engaged debate about the facts, the law, and the case, and not about fiction and fancy and fairy tales. It's important to understand this debate, and I can only mention a few points in the short time that I have, and let me just get to it. The first point that was made that was an extraordinary one was that division and failure are likely to result from litigation. Division and failure. Let's talk about division. It seems to me that any time we talk about race in this country, it is of necessity divisive. We have never had a serious conversation about race without it being divisive. And we've tried to talk in the halls of justice. We've tried to talk on the streets. It never works. Of course it's divisive when we talk about race because some people don't want to deal with race. But who is it dividing and how is it divisive? And when is it divisive? It's not reparations that's divisive. What was divisive is when Africans said we should be free as human beings and not be slaves in America. That was divisive. That's why we lost 600,000 lives, not because it's Union versus Confederacy. It was because black people demanded to be free. And it was divisive because white people didn't want, even in 1865, black people to be free. Of course it's divisive. Let's talk about civil rights. Let's talk about divisive. Black people said in the 1950s, we just want an equal opportunity, that's all. Do you think it was accepted anywhere in America? Whether in Topeka, Kansas, or Washington, D.C., or New York City, there wasn't a place where people said, yes, you are welcome in our community. Every time we talk about integration or race, it's divisive. How many lives were lost in the civil rights movement? How many heads were beaten going over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965? What about Philadelphia, Mississippi? Of course, when you talk about race, it's divisive. And we go to the courts not because we want to go to the courts, because we have to go to the courts because everyone else has capitulated and failed to do their job. And let's talk about reparations. We are a nation that loves reparations. We believe in reparations. We had no reluctance at all to repair Europe after the war, did we? The Marshall Plan. Those are reparations. They didn't ask for my vote. They didn't ask for my view, but we rebuilt Europe with American dollars. That's reparations. We were told that the Japanese had dropped the bomb on Pearl Harbor. Did we tell them, Japanese Americans, you're entitled to no relief because someone dropped a bomb on America? No, we didn't. We told the Japanese in the 1940s they didn't have a right because they were in internment camps. We told them that in the 50s. We told it in the 60s and 70s and the 80s. We told them, you can't have a case as we've heard here because the statute of limitations has passed. It's too far back. You can't have a case because the government has immunity. But you know what? In 1988, the government gave the Japanese Americans reparations because it was the right thing to do, and that's why they did it. It's not just the Japanese Americans. Just a month ago, in the state of Florida, in the city of Miami, a federal judge, Judge Patricia Stites, did something extraordinary that tells us why we're on the right course. This was a case of Hungarian Jews who had their property and goods taken during the horrible Holocaust. And the government has been saying since 1940s, you can't bring this case. It's too late. It's the statute of limitations has passed. Judge Stites had the courage to say, no, 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 they've always had a valid case. You, the government, hid it from them. You hid the evidence of their case. It's the exact same thing with reparations. The evidence of black exploitation isn't new. It's hundreds of years old. It's been hidden, and we are in the process of uncovering that history and making sure that people are being compensated. It's extraordinary to say the Civil War might have paid reparations. That's not the most clever argument I've heard. I've heard the argument that you can't come for reparations now because we've already paid black reparations. We gave you welfare. Excuse me? Or we gave you affirmative action. Excuse me? Think of all the limited and simplistic remedies that have been addressing the harms that might affect some aspect of our community, but never, ever, ever comprehensively addressing the masses of people of African descent. It has never happened. Not the civil rights movement, not affirmative action, not integration, because some of us couldn't move to a better place. And some of us couldn't go to these schools. And some of us couldn't get those jobs. And some of us don't have that health care. And some of us can't live in that neighborhood. So that repair has never, ever happened. And it's simplistic to say it has. And let's talk about the government. We can't sue the government because the government was not involved in discrimination against us. Excuse me. Let's do a little history lesson. It was not Jim Crow or his godson, Jimmy Lee Crow, who created the problem. It was the government. It wasn't some neighbor of yours who put up signs saying colored only and white only. It was not in one area or one state or at one time. It was a national effort, as despicable and as outrageous as apartheid in South Africa. In fact, South African apartheid grew its lesson, its whole theme, from the United States effort at segregation. The government was not involved. It was the government who did not let us go to these places. When you talk about a school or a job, that's not private discrimination. That's government discrimination, and it wasn't against you because you were poor or because of your religion or because of your height. It was only because of your race. It was race. It was specifically race. That's what Jim Crow laws were about. And so let's just not talk about slavery. We can argue about what slavery did. It didn't end with the Emancipation Proclamation. It just took another form, and it became broader and more significant. And what's significant about what we're hearing today is all the arguments that we've heard before. It's too late. You can't sue. And the other point that I heard today, which is a very curious one, well, you better be careful. And it's a very interesting thing to say to this audience. Be careful, because this litigation is not going to help the people. It's going to help the lawyers. Let me tell you about the lawyers working with me. They are the best. And they have already beaten American companies and corporations and businesses for not millions, but billions of dollars. They have no fear of litigating, and they have no fear of losing. They know they can win. But there's something else you have to understand. Not a single lawyer, not a single social scientist like Professor Manning Marable or Dr. James Comer or Dr. Janetta Cole, not any of those people are getting any money for this. They're doing it because it's a righteous cause whose time has come. It's not about the money. And it's really remarkable when we talk about reparations, because everybody else gets paid. Everybody else gets paid. And they're trying to make our case the exception, not the rule. The rule is that there's a harm, whether it's 5 years or 10 years, or 100 years or 500 years, people get paid. And it's not a public referendum. No one asked any of you in 1988 if Bob Dole and Ronald Reagan had your authority to pay Japanese Americans reparations. Did you get a call? I didn't get a call. But you paid. You paid. You paid because it was right. I don't think any of you got a call 3 years ago when Judge Paul Friedman in the Federal District Court in Washington, D.C. had tens of thousands of black farmers who proved a history of discrimination. And let me tell you why it's so hard. They are right in what they say about the theory of litigation. Of course it's hard. The people throughout the country who work for the Department of Agriculture, they never kept records that they discriminated against blacks because that would be too obvious. If you're a black farmer, you said, I'm coming in, I want my subsidy to grow my wheat or my corn, they would say, boy, you're at the wrong place and leave. Or, give me your farm, it would go in the trash. So the black farmers had not a single record to prove the harm. But you know what? The judge said, you know what? 20,000 black people, none of them got any of this government money over 30 years. I can't believe that the government didn't have some complicity in that. And the government doesn't deal with immunity. The government won't allow itself to be sued. Well, it allowed itself to be subject to a $2 billion settlement by black farmers because it knew that it was the right thing to do. I'm not at all worried that this case is hard. Of course it's hard. How do you think Thurgood Marshall felt when he stood before 9 white men in 1953 saying when we had the reason the Supreme Court that said that we were separate but equal, he said, I want to end that and I want us to have integration. Every commentator around the country, every scholar said it's hopeless. The law is clear. You don't have a case. You can't change their mind, but he did. With hard work, careful research, and yes, moral courage. It takes a little bit of moral courage to fight these battles. They aren't easy. We're not tobacco lawyers trying to rip somebody off for our own benefit. We're not tort lawyers trying to make ourselves wealthy. These lawyers who are working with me, they already got it made. Willie Gary has a 737 gold-plated plane, I've been in it, called the Scales of Justice. Willie Gary doesn't need any money. He will take it if you give it to him. But the point is, he's willing to take cases that look to other people to be hopeless. That's what they told him in Mississippi. They offered Willie Gary $100,000 for a case. And he turned it down. They said, you're going to regret it. He litigated the case, and he won $500 million. And so when people, Dennis Sweet, another one of our lawyers, they tried to offer him in the FinFin case a settlement. He refused it, and they insisted on going to trial. And he won that case and won $400 million. Case after case after case after case. Johnny Cochran's done the same thing. Most people think that Johnny Cochran was discovered with O.J. Simpson in 1995. Johnny Cochran's been practicing for 40 years. Millions of dollars of cases that people said nobody could win. I'm not thrilled that we're litigating in court. I wish that Congress had the courage to recognize what it did. No one denies that slavery was horrible. No one denies that the perpetuation of slavery and the legacy of slavery continue with the Jim Crow laws. No one can deny the government's complicity in that. No one denies that there was something called white privilege. People, simply because you were white, you could drink at the fountain. You could stay at the hotel. You could live in the neighborhood. You can get a loan from the bank. You could be an ordinary citizen because of your whiteness. But if you were black, wealthy or not, you could not. That's what we're talking about. This is not some obscure argument about whether or not slavery existed. We know it existed. But we can't let people forget what it did and how our government has continued to perpetuate that legacy even today. Now, let me give you a couple of examples. My time has expired, and I'm just getting fired up, but I've got to end. Let me just say this. It is remarkable in terms of what we're discovering. When we talked about reparations a few years ago, it was an idea that people thought was silly. But every single month, we find another example that overwhelmingly supports what we're arguing. How many of you have heard about the insurance company MetLife? MetLife. It's very interesting. Most of you have not heard about it. which is a shame. It tells you how discrimination can be so palpable and so widespread nationwide, and we don't even know it. For decades, MetLife charged people higher insurance rates simply because they were black. And it took us decades to catch them. And now they're paying more than $160 million to settle those cases. But you know what? There's not just one MetLife. There's a bunch of them. And that's the point, uncovering the fact that these things are not just in the past, they continue to happen. Who benefits? It's not the lawyers. It may not even be many of you, if I have my point of view. What do I mean by that? I have a very specific theory about reparations and what should happen. Every descendant of African slave, as these cases are litigated, are entitled to reparations. We're going to win. But I have another argument. Winning the battle is not winning the war, because my argument is very different. Once we get that money, I'm going to tell you, I don't want you to get a check. I'm not going to take a check. Let me be clear. Because if we win, as we will, and this money is available, most of us, we don't need that money. But there are people on whose shoulders we stand who desperately need it. If you look at health care, where we are, look at housing, look at education, employment. We are in a desperate situation. And if we are really talking about reparations, repair, we can't take a check or a Lexus or an SUV. We need to go right back to those communities where Watts didn't do it, the Civil Rights Movement didn't do it, integration didn't do it. Black people are worse off, hear me, are worse off in many of the schools that Thurgood Marshall tried to integrate in 1950. They're worse off in 2002 than they were as a result of integration. So our goal is to win, but this time the money's not going to stop here. It's going to what we call the bottom stuck, the poorest of the poor. When people say, what you going to do for me now? We're going to talk about real health care so that if you solve the health care problem in the black community, it's not a black solution. It's an American solution. Dr. Hood will tell you, if we're all healthy, that's not just helping blacks. Then we can work. Then we can go to school. We can be employed. That's not a black solution. If we solve the housing problem, it's not a black solution. It's an American solution. And why is the reparations issue so important now? Well, let me tell you why. Discrimination is as rampant today as it was a long time ago, but it's different. For a while, it was just race and almost class-based. But some of those of you who are wearing the three-piece suit and the nice Giovanni, even you face it. You are escorted through the department stores, no matter how well you look. You pay more when you get a loan to buy a house, even though you can afford it, because you're black. You pay higher rates at the bank on interest because of your race. You pay higher health care because of your race. There is a black tax in America, and no one is addressing that issue. The bottom line is that this lawsuit is about harm that we can date back to the Civil War. And we keep forgetting that. General Sherman's order number 15 was very significant. And the earlier commentator was right. It wasn't just whites who died in the Civil War. There were a lot of blacks. But blacks had a contract. They were made a promise. The promise couldn't have been clearer. What were they told? Each family shall have a plot of not more than 40 acres. It didn't say in mule. You made that up. 40 acres of tillable ground. That is, the agreement was, if you fight this war to make America a union, the property's yours. And we fought and we shed our blood. The moment the war ended, the agreement was rescinded for us. But beyond that, talking about reparations, who got reparations? The former slave owners. I'm not making this history up. I'm just reading it to understand it is a substantial matter, not an insubstantial matter. Our claims are multifaceted. They are powerful. They're persuasive. I can say this, that as much as we can debate and get into high theory and have interesting discussions, the fact of the matter that it's really not about us. They told those Africans who were free back then, just wait. It's too early to talk about reparations. It's going to come. Too early. And now they're saying, okay, you descendants of those Africans, it's too late. Why did you wait so long? We are not doing this for you, or even our children or grandchildren. We're doing it for those who aren't here, who don't have a voice, who were thrown off slave ships. We have to remember that. Who lost their name, their culture, their religion, their sense of family, sense of community, all the resources. That's what we're doing it for. We cannot let history say that we didn't stand up to say it was wrong, and we will fight our entire lives to right it, not just for us, but for those who never had the chance to speak for themselves.